Hello everyone, welcome back. If you are new here, my name is Jasmine and I specialize in realistic drawings of your favorite pop culture characters. If you are new here, welcome and thank you so much for joining me. The reason you're probably here is because you want to learn more about drawing hair. There is a part 1 to this tutorial. If you want to learn the beginning of drawing hair like this one, make sure you check out part 1. I will leave it in the description and there will probably be a card here somewhere in the video. So this is part 2 of coloring hair. If you are a returning subscriber, thank you so much for being here again. Today we are going over part 2 of coloring Jason Momoa's hair. So normally I start with the background. If it's a really detailed hair section, I will start coloring the background because I'll have to go over later with the eraser and the X-Acto knife, so we're gonna go over a little bit of that today. Make sure you like and subscribe if you like watching these tutorials. It is a free way to support this channel, and you can check out my other work on my website, jasminebakerart.com, where you can purchase prints and merch. And now let's get started with part 2. Now this background has a little bit of a warmer toned green. It's kind of like a blue green, but there is a little bit of a warmer tone. With that, I decided to do a little bit of an orange base in the upper part of that, so that's where you see the orange there. And then I did alternate between black. Over that orange, I used this kind of bright blue. I think it says gray blue, but it's really hard to read. I'm pretty sure it says gray blue. The color or the text is all like rubbed off on the pencil, so I'm not entirely sure what the name of that is. This is kind of like a marbly background, but it's still kind of blurry. I decided to use the Prussian blue because it's a very, very pigmented, deep, dark blue. Kind of like indigo. If you had to pick an equivalent in Prismacolor, it would probably be the indigo color. So I started with the darker colors for that section. This also makes a good contrast against his skin because the background is pretty warm and it brings out a little bit more of the skin in the portrait. It's kind of hard to tell right now because you can only see one little section of his face, but it does make a little bit of a difference. I think backgrounds are important because it does help you set the mood of the drawing. It's not just the face itself or the clothes that the person's wearing. I think the background has a lot to do with the mood and the composition. I didn't want to copy the background completely, so I did make it a little bit more blurry than the original background, and I made it more blue instead of like a blue-gray. It's like a deeper blue, and I think that goes pretty well with his eyes. I think it brings out his eyes more. So this is kind of like a background slash hair tutorial. They're in the same area and you need one to do the other, so that's why I'm doing the tutorial this way. This is more of a hair tutorial in the second half. A couple of other colors that I use are the Payne's Gray 30% and this green, which is a chromium oxide green, just to bring a little bit of a light green to the portrait without making it darker. Green is very useful in a lot of portraits. I think we kind of underestimate using a lot of green because I even use green in skin. But for this, I went over that with that, I think it's the gray blue and then the chromium oxide green. And that's when I start putting heavier pressure on the pencil because I'm not doing a huge amount of layering. So the burnishing is where this really comes in handy. When you're doing backgrounds, I think burnishing is great because you get a really, really nice solid color and it just adds more depth to the background. It's like more believable to me. I guess that's I don't know if that's the word I want to describe it, but it's just like a really solid color background and it's very vibrant, and I think it really helps bring the whole piece together. Now over top the orange, I used that not the Prussian blue, I'm sorry. Over top the orange, I used that dark sap green. I really like this color. It's such a pretty color. It's a really deep, dark green. So this is about the darkest green that you can get before you reach black. This is probably a color I'm going to use pretty often. I actually have a lot of this. I'll use this a lot for the suit later on. I do have to fix the suit. Unfortunately, I made it a little bit too narrow, so before I start coloring any more, I have to go and fix that. He looks a little bit weird right now because I drew this at so many different angles and at different times in my life that I have to go back and fix things now. Because whatever I started 4 or 5, 6 years ago, obviously my eyes changed or something, or my skills got better, so I have to go back and change a lot of stuff to make it look better before I continue to color. After I use the dark sap green, I decided to go over that with the Prussian blue to really make it a deep, deep blue color. With a little bit of green, you can kind of still tell that there's green there. This is kind of a similar process that you use when you're coloring any kind of stone-like surface or anything that's like has like a marbly effect. This would be a similar thing that you use. And then I use the Payne's Gray and the Slate Gray to kind of tie that light blue and the dark blue together. After that, I decided to use the small tip on the battery eraser to take take away color so that I can add a brighter color later. And then there is this other aqua color that I like that I also erased and then used that where the little white paper is. That other bright color that I'm using to fill in some of that light blue area is the light malachite green. It's a bright aqua, and that's also where I colored in where I had originally erased. After that, I used the larger tip on the battery eraser with the higher powered battery eraser because I wanted to get a little bit more color removed from the paper before I continued. Once I did that, I went in with that malachite green with a little bit of layering. I didn't color super heavily with that. Over top that malachite green, I used a Prussian blue again. So it kind of looks like a light Prussian blue, so I added depth to that without really doing a lot. And then for the really, really dark sections, I did have to use black for the really, really dark lines, and then I went around the black with the French gray to kind of blend it out. And here I am drawing those really squiggly lines, kind of like what Marble has, using the black pencil still. Below that, I started with the French gray. That is the French gray 30%. That is the medium French gray, which I use a lot of. Normally I use that a lot in faces. I don't use it a lot in backgrounds, but today I had to do that. With that, I just did a light layer of that as the base. So you can see I colored that whole section there with the French gray, and the colors that I add on top of that will be toned down a little bit. So the Prussian blue goes over the French gray, and then that dark sap green goes over both of those colors. And you'll see there's a large white section where I colored a little bit of black, but I'm starting to go over that with this really pale gray blue called Payne's Gray 30%. It's about the same value as the French gray 30%. The Payne's gray is a blue tone gray, and the French gray is a really warm tone gray, but they're about the same value if you look at them on a value scale. So I'm still doing the layering. I don't do the burnishing just yet for this part, and then I'm going over that with the malachite green, and then that Prussian blue is when I start adding more pressure on the pencils to make everything blend together. Everything doesn't have to be blended super smoothly because it's a background, so you're making it very blurry anyways. You don't have to be super picky with how the colors blend together. As long as there's a lot of color on the paper and there's not really any paper showing through, I think you'll be fine. You can be a lot more, I'd say, like sloppy for lack of a better word when it comes to this. You don't have to be super precise with all the lines that you're putting down because everything's going to get blended together eventually, and the whole effect of that is supposed to be like a little bit blurry, a little bit fuzzy, because it's kind of a distance from the subject, so you have to think about it in your mind how far away the background section is from the subject. So that also really helps with you determining like the depth of things. Since Jason Momoa is the foreground, the background needs to be pretty far back, and I think that adds to the realism of it. I also used some buff titanium. I really like that color because it's a warm toned white, so a lot of times I will use that when I have to use like blue or like a really bold color because I feel like it works really well with those types of pigments. And for this part, I can't see what color that is. I believe it is either the French gray 10% or the raw umber 10%. They're pretty similar. They're both really warm toned, like really pale grays. So I used that near where the hair, kind of near where the bottom of the hair is, so you can see me coloring that whole section, those light colors. And then I went over that with the Payne's gray. So when you layer a lot of color onto the paper like that, the final stage of blending becomes really easy. And this is the part where I add the Prussian blue. As you can see, the Prussian blue, when you're adding it on top of a color, like a bright color like that, the blue is a lot brighter than it would be if you just colored it directly onto the white paper, which is what I wanted. I wanted it to be a little bit more vibrant. And now since this is the last layer of this background section, I'm using the dark sap green to go over everything. When you're adding the final color, you'll start to see the little variations in the colors underneath, and that kind of adds all of the, you know, the different values of green under that. So the overall objective of this is to make a lot of values in green without doing a lot of work. So you'll still have all of those light and dark colors show through, but you're not doing a lot of extra work blending each individual color as you move around the area. Once you get the green over like the really light gray areas or the white areas, you don't have to do a huge amount of blending to get the texture effect that you want. You just have to add a little bit of extra pressure with whatever the final color is on top of everything, like this malachite green I was adding, and then that Payne's gray 30%. I started using those over top just to make some of the sections a little bit brighter, and then I use the dark sap green over top of that. Sometimes I feel like the backgrounds take take forever. I feel like it's never going to end. This one doesn't have a huge amount of background. It's kind of like the Henry Cavill drawing. You're doing just enough to where it's not like a simple background, so it still adds something to the portrait. And then before I add that final layer again of green, as you can see kind of towards the bottom, I went in with that Payne's gray. And usually for this, I'll color in both horizontal and vertical lines. It just depends on what I want to do, how much paper I need to fill in. That gray blue, which is kind of like a true blue, it's pretty vibrant. To me, it doesn't really look like gray, but according to the name, it has some kind of gray in it. That adds a little bit more blue to the green, so you're still getting more depth in there without doing a lot of extra work. And then I'm still using the heavy pressure, kind of burnishing it, just to get everything completely filled in, because I don't want any white paper showing through. That's something that I'm still working on, is making sure the paper is completely filled in. I'm trying to get over my fear of messing up. So towards the bottom of that, I decided to do a really thick layer of the malachite green before I went over that with the dark sap green. It wasn't quite as light as I wanted it to be, so that's why I ended up adding that extra layer of color. Some of the lines got a little bit erased, so I had to go back and add those in so that I could color where I'm supposed to color. After I did that thick layer of the dark sap green, I got my battery eraser and started erasing little tiny chunks away just to get some really light highlights in there. And when you're adding really tiny dots like that, it makes it so much easier to color with the pencil and add highlights. And again, that's not like a huge amount of extra work in my opinion. I'm kind of making like a marbly effect with the erasers. So I am alternating between the small and large tip erasers. It just depends on the area that I'm working on. You'll see there that the blue battery eraser has a lot more power. It erases more to a white paper, whereas the black eraser, it doesn't have quite as high a battery power or rotations per minute, so it doesn't quite erase completely to white, and that's kind of why I like that one for certain areas. You can see that there's still some green showing through with that one. This dark sap green is a very pigmented green, so it will stain the paper. It's kind of like using a really bright red. It can be very difficult to erase away if you don't have the proper eraser. Just a lot of dots. It kind of looks like I'm drawing a forest, but it will definitely look like blurry stone once I'm done. I think the erasing is probably the easier part. So I'm kind of picking and choosing where I want the really bright areas to stay. I'm still alternating between the small and large tips of the erasers. I also changed the pressure that I'm using on each eraser, and then towards the bottom, instead of doing a bunch of just dots, I did horizontal lines. Below that section, that whole section that I did, I used the Prussian blue to start a deeper layer of pencil there. That's where his hair ends. I have to color all of that in with the green before I start coloring the hair, because when you color the hair before the background, in this case, it's very difficult to color a background. You'll end up having to color over the hair anyways, and then it's going to look like a mess. With this, you'll be able to erase away the layers that you need to color and then add in the brown. It's much easier to do it that way, and the background still stays smooth. It still stays the original texture and the original color that you did. Whereas if you did the background after the hair, you would have to worry about coloring around each section of hair, and it just turns into a mess. And it does affect the lines that you're using to draw, because you might end up getting a section where it looks like it is very obvious that you were avoiding the hair area. So it's just easier to do the background first. Just trust me on that. It is much easier to do the background before everything else. So in those erase areas, I use the raw umber 10% and the French gray 10%. Make sure the pencils are really sharp if you're doing something like that, so that you can get a good layer of color in there. Easier, it'll save you time if the pencils are sharper that way. And then the French gray also came in handy. I still wanted some areas to be a paler gray green, so I found that to be pretty useful. And on here you would still be burnishing when you're coloring in areas where you have erased. It's very easy to burnish. Instead of adding a bunch of colors in the area, you can just color it with a thick layer of pencil. And then I still use the horizontal layer coloring just for the sake of simplicity. So I'm still adding in the texture there, as you can see around the hair. That's exactly why I said to do the background first. It won't change the texture of the background too much when you're adding in the hair after. The Payne's gray and the dark sap green, I started adding in back with the malachite green. It's pretty bright. So you still have that dark sap green that mixes with the brighter colors, but there's not a huge amount of it underneath those colors. It still kind of looks cohesive because you have that underlying green color. It's also good to invest in a good soft bristle brush. You can brush away the eraser stubble and the pencil stubble so you can keep your paper clean. Okay, my voice was going out there. I ended up using a lot of that light malachite green. I think it's a very pretty color. I use a lot of it on the background. It blends really well with the dark sap green because both pencils are pretty soft, so there's a lot of pigment in those particular colors and they mesh really well together. Towards the bottom of that section that I colored, I used the French gray again. I used a lot of that French gray in this piece, more than I thought I was going to. I didn't really think I was going to use a lot of that for the background, but I did. And then I have the Payne's gray, which I'm alternating between that and the French gray, and then doing a light layer of the dark sap green over top of that to tie everything together. The hair that is further back or that's really dark, I use black and I made it a very solid black color, or I made it a pretty thick layer of black and then I put like a sepia or the dark flesh color over top of that just to make it really dark before I go in and etch away the individual hairs. So this has to be a very thick layer of pencil with no paper showing through in order for you to do this effectively. He does have a lot of hair. There is a little bit of a challenge with that because his hair, it's not only different colors because he has highlights in it, but there's a little bit of different textures. There's a little bit of curling and there's just some waves and some parts just look like they're straight and it's going in every direction on both sides of his face. And then you have to remember to add the highlights in after that. But the highlights are always last, so we're not going to focus on that today. I believe this color is either black or sepia. I think it's black, and there's a section way in the back where I ended up using the dark flesh just to make sure that it looks brown and that I can add highlights over top of that brown. I did start etching away a little bit of the strands towards the top of the hair, and now you can see why I said to color the background first, because you can't do this if you do the hair first. And the battery eraser came in pretty handy. For hair, I like to use the larger tip battery eraser because the small one doesn't erase lines that thin for hair, so I like using the larger one for that. That's not for super fine hair anyways, but it's for smaller sections of hair where you need thin lines. And then for, of course, the super thin lines of hair, you'll use the X-Acto knife. Hair is fairly easy if you can get to color. If you can color it in very large sections of color first, kind of like blocking everything in, it will make it very easy for you to add in strands with that X-Acto knife or with an eraser. Or you can even without an X-Acto knife, you can still add more hair strands over top of a black or a dark brown. You could go in with one of the beige colors, you can go in with white, a light gray, and still add depth to that hair without taking away color. You can still draw strands of hair over top the dark color. At least with the Caran d'Ache and the Prismacolor you can, because the pencils have such a high pigment amount, but they're soft core pencils. You can add a light color on top of a dark color and still give the illusion of hair, which is why I like both of those brands. And that is all I have for you guys today. So this was the hair and background part 2. The next one will be the background by itself, because there's another section of background that I worked on after this. And then after that will be another hair part for the left side of his hair. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe if you like this video, if you want to learn how to draw stuff like this. I try to make photorealism as easy to learn as possible. So if you have any questions, leave them down in the description box, and I will see you in the next one.